All right, welcome. I'm Mackenzie Warren, news executive at Gannett, and I'm on location in Boston here at the IRE, Investigative Reporters and Editors Conference, and I'm with our colleague Tom Frank. Tom's an investigative reporter at USA Today, and here in 2012 was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in the explanatory writing category. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that project, Tom, but lots of other things that I want to get to you with. You've just won an array of awards over your career for investigative reporting on all sorts of topics. Police brutality, campaign finance, failures at the TSA, billions of taxpayer dollars going into a boondoggle rural airport program, the public pension story that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. But I want to go into the Wayback Machine here and go back to your first job, and when you first became an investigative reporter. You're 23 years old, back in Easton, PA. Yes. Take us back there and what some of your work was entailing back then.
You mean the day-to-day work or the investigative work?
Well, as we've talked about it, it seems like the two are one and the same. So
right.
Let's talk a little bit about the police brutality story, for example.
So this was in the Easton Express, 45,000 circulation daily in the northeastern part of Pennsylvania. Okay. And this was in the mid-'80s. The city had this reputation for years and years of having this brutal police force that just handled people roughly, hurt people. There were lawsuits, and it had been sort of on the to-do list at the paper for who knows how many years, and it just got sort of like a will. It was just bequeathed from one reporter to another. One reporter would have it, he'd work on it for a little while, then he'd leave, and so finally it fell onto my desk. And I volunteered because I had some idealism at that point, and I really I was like the most eager, enthusiastic journalist.
Well, you haven't got idealism now?
It's been tempered by some reality, but I really wanted to do something that I thought was crusading and that would also challenge power. There was something just sort of appealing about doing both of those. Yeah. So I took that story on, and I ended up working on it. It took a total of 2 years, which is not to say I worked on it every day for 2 years. I might work on it for like a solid week or two and then put it aside for 2 or 3 weeks because there was something big happening, because I was also covering City Hall.
And that doesn't just take 3 weeks off when you need 3 weeks to work.
That's
on
right,
story.
And I liked doing the City Hall and the day-to-day stuff. So I basically at that point took the attitude that I was going to work on the police story sort of when I really did have time, because I didn't want to. The staff was fairly small, and there wasn't sort of room for someone just to take a year and do nothing but one story, and I didn't want to do that either because I was enjoying writing this city council stories and whatnot.
Yeah. So you chipped away at it and you got to it. It was at some personal risk, though.
So the story really it scared me in a way that I haven't been scared on other stories, and I don't know whether that's because I was sort of young and didn't really know what I was doing. Easton's a very small city, 25,000 people, and so it was, everyone knew everyone. There were these little petty things, like I would go to some event and there would be a couple of cops there, and they just sort of like stand right behind me like this.
For some subtle intimidation.
Right, and and that really got to me, and they were trying to get to me, and they sure did it. Yeah. And so I think that probably also slowed me down because when you're afraid, you get tripped up. So it took me a couple years to just finally I wanted to make sure that I had an airtight story and didn't leave any angle uncovered. In the end, I ended up writing an 8-day series, which I thought was way too long. I remember the first day the first story came out, I was just shocked at how much space it took up. I was like envisioning it was just going to be much more compact. But it was also, I sort of look back on it, something I'm really, really proud of, because I did it at such a young age, and there was a lot of really good stuff I found. I think that it sort of got lost in the volume, and that it might have been a stronger piece if it was, maybe half the volume that it was.
Well, that wouldn't be the first time writing would have been improved by slicing
Yeah,
it in half.
absolutely, absolutely.
Well, yeah, and one wonders what we might have done with that story today, with all the different social media aspects that we have, and ways
Right.
to do things on the web with multimedia storytelling.
Oh, I think back on ways I could have done it differently. I mean, the other thing that was hard is that, I was covering City Hall on a day-to-day basis, and
Yeah.
yet I was also investigating City Hall.
Sure.
And
Makes it tricky.
it is tricky, because obviously you have to maintain the relations to do the day-to-day coverage, but there's obviously, you're going to alienate people when you take on a story like this.
Well, I happen to have a quote here from you that speaks to that. Every single investigative story I've done started with something small on a beat.
Right.
So it sounds to me as though working the City Hall beat and doing the police story are, in fact, directly related, and perhaps one couldn't have happened without the other.
Well, that's actually an example of an idea that I didn't come up with that. That had been an idea that had been around for long before. But, I'm thinking of you cover a beat, and you're learning stuff every day, and because that gives you the ideas. And so, yes, I've never done, well, except for Easton, I guess, and maybe this is one of the problems, one of these, let's start with a concept and investigate that, or let's look at this. It's rather, I just discovered this thing that I never knew about, and this seems odd, and I want to look into it. And the good thing about those stories is, because when you start on them, if you're a beat reporter, you have the background knowledge, so that when you see something that strikes you as odd, it is odd, because you have the context.
You're a credible expert in this.
Right, you are an expert, and the context enables you to immediately grasp the significance of something that doesn't seem right, as opposed to if you're coming in from the outside, is this right, is this wrong, is there something odd here? You don't necessarily know that right away, at least.
And that speaks to building your expertise on your beat, that goes well beyond whatever stories you're going to write tomorrow, doesn't
Right.
it? In reading everything you can that's tangentially related, and so on. Well, that's interesting, and it ties to another thing that we've talked about before, and that is as you become more expert in a beat, and you become more efficient in executing your day in and day out coverage, you can do that in a good quality product in less and less time, to therefore free up more time for the very time-consuming investigative journalism. And so you've done that, sometimes to the point where you don't necessarily mention when you have a few free minutes to an editor who might be lurking over your
deliberately
shoulder.
mislead them.
Yes.
No, I'll say it on camera. Yes, one of the things that I've really learned over the years, because until very recently I was never a full-time investigative reporter. I was always a beat reporter who liked to do investigations, and I was always a beat reporter in these really high-volume beats, like City Hall, State House, Homeland Security.
Never-ending churn of content.
Yeah, and one thing I learned how to do is to make time for myself instead of asking for time, because the answer for that is often predictable, and you're less likely to get time for something speculative. So if I were to go to an editor and say, hey, look, there's this thing I have, I think it's interesting, will you give me a week? He's probably going to say, well, I don't know. So why bother with that whole process? Better to just, I have a story I have to get done today. I think I can do it in 4 hours, and I'm going to take the other, 4 hours, and I'm going to work on this. Or, I'm going to tell my editor, yeah, I think I can get that story for you, next Monday.
Sure.
But
if I really hustle.
But yeah, I could get it done, 3 days earlier. So it's sort of like stealing time. And the advantage of that is that instead of asking an editor for time to explore something, you come to an editor and say, hey, look, I've just been looking around a little bit, and here's what I found. And what do you think?
Follow that.
And when you have something developed and you can say to an editor, look, here's what I know, here's what I can do, here's what this story will say, here's how I'm going to get it, it's very, very hard to say no, because then an editor's saying no to a really, really good story.
Sure. Well, that's harder to say no to then, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's an important thing to learn how to do, to sort of prioritize things. And you know, as you were talking about, like when you have the expertise on your beat, you can do things more quickly, you know, without necessarily cutting corners.
You just get better at it.
You get better at it, and
much time.
you also learn, you know, to eliminate unnecessary reporting that you learn. I could make these, do all this extra work, but you know, it's not really going to go into the daily story for tomorrow. So,
yeah, sure.
But it's definitely a balancing act.
Now I want to talk about hard skills. Of course, there are the soft skills like being curious and having a good sort of BS detector and all that stuff. But you've challenged yourself and learned new things along the way. Some of the computer programs like Excel and Access that you've learned and maybe you wouldn't say mastered, but become competent in. Say a few words about how you took that on and how you leaned on others to teach you.
So yeah, Excel and Access are two. What they help you do is analyze. They don't help you get anything. You're not going to find anything, you know, but it helps
Unless
you.
you know how to look for what you're looking for.
Yeah, it helps you organize your information, and then it can help you do some analysis of, you know, large quantities of data very, very quickly. So how did I learn it? Very, very slowly. And you know, learning both Access and Excel is sort of like learning a language in the sense that you have to use it a lot to get fluent. You can't just like, I'm going to go take a course in Excel, you know, for 2 days and I'm going to get good, and I'm not going to use it for a month because you're going to go back and be like, oh wait, how do you do this thing?
Yeah, that doesn't work.
So you have to use it enough to get to the point where you basically understand it. And where I really got to learn Access, which is the much harder program, was I don't know, in the late 90s when I was at Newsday on Long Island. I was doing a very complicated, in-depth story about taxes and tax rates and property and so forth. And basically, I used Access like every day for you know, a month.
Yeah.
But the thing about Access is that I thought, oh man, I've mastered this, but no, you've like mastered Intro to Access, and like I did what I could, but there's so much more you can do. So then, when I was at USA Today, I had the good fortune of sitting next to a colleague who was a master at this, and I would always be like, hey, Brad, how do I do this? And this is Brad Heath, my colleague, was always gracious and patient, and he really helped me learn a lot. And so I remember just finally I said, how did you learn all this stuff? And he's like, I just did exactly what you were doing when he was at, I don't know, Detroit. Like, he would just bug people.
Just bug some other guy that knew.
So it's great if you work with or near someone who has really, really good skills, because you can really lean on those people.
Yeah. You know, one theme that's emerging as we've had these conversations, Barbara Leader from the News Star on Monroe was talking a lot about leaning on colleagues and you know, trading knowledge or information or inspiration or just helping people out of a jam of, I'll cover your story so you can nail that thing that's taking you longer. Jesse here works in Central Ohio on the Watchdog team, and they you do Watchdog work across all 10 newspapers in Central Ohio and help each other out on that, right? So it's oftentimes teamwork is a pretty big factor, we find. Let's talk a little bit about, you've been overseas many times and worked overseas, and I don't want to approach this necessarily from the angle of doing watchdog work overseas, because oftentimes your stints have been too brief for that, but any observations that you've come away with in being overseas that have caused you to approach investigative journalism differently or appreciate it in a different light when you're back here on domestic soil?
So when I'm overseas, and mostly I've been to Iraq, and I spent a little bit of time in Israel during the 2006 war with Lebanon, there's no such thing as computer-assisted reporting. There's no, because the internet barely functions over there, so you have to rely much more on the sort of skills you learn first, like the interviewing and listening,
stuff.
and also I think one thing that's really important, and this goes for any reporting, but it's to understand context so you can see anomaly. And that was always one of the hardest things about, like, I would get sent over to Iraq for like a month or two to fill in for our normal person.
Chief.
Yeah, exactly. And to like come into this, I mean, this is one of the most complicated stories to begin with, and to come in there and to try to understand it was really, really hard. I mean, I had one sort of investigative success in Iraq, and I got it by going to a news conference at, this was in the Green Zone, and the U.S. military, the State Department would hold, a news conference every week, every few days, and this, like Brigadier General or something was talking, and he's just going like, here are accomplished, blah, 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 and he made this comment about, and we entered, 6,000 Iraqis this week in our new database. And whenever I hear, like, entering people's IDs in databases, that just the radar goes off. And so I just, that's where there was no documents, there was no computer assisted. This was just talking to people, the U.S. military, about what they were doing. What they were doing is...
It helped to be there when the Brigadier General said this.
It helped to be there. It also helped that this is what I mean about context, that no other reporter in the room, and there were like a dozen reporters, American reporters, understood it.
Hey, wait, there's a flag.
And because I had covered a lot of security, Homeland Security, I knew that the issue of databases of people's IDs and biometrics, like fingerprints and iris scans, is a big civil... So I wrote this story about how the U.S. military is amassing this database of tens of thousands of Iraqis, taking the fingerprints and iris scan of every person they ever arrest, and basically sort of feeding it into the U.S. intelligence apparatus. It was... It was the one story I'm really proud of having done. The rest of it was just like, what bombing happened today. And that was a story I was able to get, just entirely by talking to people.
Yeah.
And the thing about that story is that the military was really proud of what they were doing.
Sure.
It was like, yes, this is helpful, and the story made that point, and it also got into the issue of, well, what does this mean that you're creating this database of Iraqis that you
and that's a whole discussion that needs to be had.
Yeah, you'd never be able to do that in the United States.
Sure. Well, that is a great story. We only have a few minutes left,
okay.
and I want to talk about the public pension story,
okay.
the one for which you've earned so many plaudits and well deserved, where you discovered that across the nation, state legislators are using payout mechanisms available only to them,
right.
to basically pad their wallets, and at a time when government is contracting and so on. Talk a little bit about all the work that went into that story.
Mm-hmm. That was, so it was, the task was enormous. It actually wasn't horribly complex, and I say that because conceptually pensions are fairly simple things. Once you understand sort of the language of pensions, it's fairly simple. There's not like you don't have to have any expertise, like scientific or engineering, to do this story, or medical. So it was a matter of basically going to all 50 states and looking through their state laws, which are uniformly on websites, and figuring out. There are, I don't know, a dozen pages of state law in every state that explain pensions, and just reading all those and getting publicly available reports that are, again, usually on websites. So because it was 50 states, it was a lot of work, but it was basically looking for the same exact thing in each 50 states. Mm-hmm. So I was able to be fairly systematic about it, just like started, Alaska, Arkansas, all the way down to Wyoming, and go through every state, figure out what information was available publicly, what did I have to FOIA, what could I or what couldn't I FOIA, sure. And then just sort of putting together like a greatest hits package almost, sure. and both looking for big picture trends, right. like trying to quantify, what's the number of state legislators who are in line to get these, how many states have these, and then what are some of the examples? So
Sure.
telling the story through both
Somebody making
anecdote,
75 times what they would make
anecdote
in their
and pattern,
salary.
really.
Yeah, and too, I mean, the widespread, systematic abuses that you discovered
Right.
across 40 states was really is going to drive change, has already started to drive
Right.
change, and will save taxpayers tens of millions, if not more, dollars ultimately.
Yeah.
So one last question I wanted to ask you, and that is, you have a second role, and that is as an adjunct professor at the
Right.
University of Maryland, the Philip Merrill School. And you know, how do you counsel these youngsters coming out of school who all have that idealism that you talked about earlier, and want to drive change and want to root out evil and want to do good? You know, what directions are you pointing those young people in?
A lot of them actually don't have that. One of the things I learned is that just because you're a journalism major doesn't mean you want to be a journalist, or doesn't mean you're going to be a journalist.
Interesting.
You know, for the ones, I would say in a class of 15, maybe 2 or so, 3 have a real interest in investigative reporting. A lot of them do. But there's, you know, some they want to be arts writers, they want to be sports writers. And you know, what I say is it's all about persistence. That's the single most important category you can have, just as a journalist in general, but especially if you want to figure out things that are going wrong. And that means, you know, making the extra phone call, you know, reading the document yourself. Don't read what some other newspaper has written about it. Go find the original report and read it yourself, because you're going to see things you don't see. And just to keep persisting and always gather documents and always print them out and read them again and again and again, because you're going to see things on the 5th reading that you didn't notice.
Sure.
It's sort of like, I do this experiment. I say, all right, think of a movie you've seen like 20 times.
Yeah.
I ask the class, you remember the first time you saw it? And what about the 5th time you saw it? Did you see things that you didn't see the first time? And like, yeah. And it's the same thing with the document.
The layers start to
well, you understand
be
the context. So this sentence that you didn't understand, it didn't seem to mean anything. Well, suddenly you understand the context, and you understand this is really important.
Yeah, great advice. All right, well, that does it for our conversation here with Tom Frank, investigative reporter at USA Today and Pulitzer Prize finalist this year. Tom, I just want to say on behalf of our colleagues at Gannett, great job.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for doing the good work that you do.
It's always fun to talk about the stuff I get to do.
Well, and thank you for talking about it, but mostly thank you for doing the good work. We'll be back with more interviews from this series here at the IRE Conference in Boston.